Global intellectual inequality, a capacious rubric, almost frustratingly so. As we all know, we live in a world marked by the unequal distribution of resources, of opportunities, of power. The coordinates and precincts of power are familiar to many of you in the room. Davos, Oxbridge, Harvard, the New York Times, Washington, D.C., Georgetown University. Who is anointed to puzzle over and respond to the pressing issues of these times? Whether it's economic inequality, the swiftly warming earth, war, ethnic cleansing, or systemic racism. Who gets a seat at the table? That terrible expression, a seat at the table. But then a more salient question, is the table itself part of the problem? Agendas, agenda setting, could the agenda itself be marked by aporia, by limitations, by blind spots? I admit these are leading questions. Could we imagine a different configuration, a different world, a more generous conversation, and the word conversation is crucial here. Could we learn from strangers? Strangers in scare quotes, of course. Perhaps one could say a patron saint of this manner of thinking is the late Martinican philosopher Edouard Glissant, who tried to do away with questions of center and periphery, invoking a tradition of exchange or créolité in his work on African diasporic cultures. Of course, this more equitable playing field sounds romantic, but it is also a landscape littered with traps. How to avoid tokenism in a liberal order marked by good intentions. How to avoid the intellectual bankruptcy of simply championing the underdog or the so-called anti-imperialist for the sake of inclusion or diversity. How to avoid the persistent accusation of cultural relativism. These are just some questions we might begin to think about today. We have three extremely distinguished interlocutors, each of whom bring a unique perspective on these questions. I'm going to briefly introduce them. To my far left is Nisreen Malik, an acclaimed British Sudanese author and journalist known for her wide-ranging commentary on issues of race, identity, politics, and international affairs. Her book, We Need New Stories, Challenging the Toxic Myths Behind Our Age of Discontent, critiques the narrative foundations of increasingly intolerant and authoritarian politics in Britain and the United States, exploring how once fringe views have gone mainstream. She writes a regular column in The Guardian and received the 2021 Robert Silvers Prize for Journalism. Ranjit Hoskote, to my immediate left, is an Indian poet, theorist, and curator whose influential work centers on the complex history and presence of cultural pluralism from the local to the global. His 8 books of poetry, including Ice Light, Jonah Whale, and a translation of a 14th century Kashmiri mystic poet, I Lala, the Poems of Lal Ded, engage with themes of identity, displacement, and transformation through time. His acclaimed 2012 book, Confluences, Forgotten Histories Between East and West, traced the rich history of intercultural and interreligious encounter that has shaped and continues to shape the contemporary world. Hoskote has curated more than 50 showcases of Indian and global art over the past 3 decades, including India's first national pavilion at the Venice Biennial. K. Anthony Appiah, professor of law and philosophy at the New York University School of Law, in the center here, is a leading scholar of literary and cultural studies with a focus on African and African-American culture. Appiah has taught at Yale, Cornell, Duke, Harvard, and Princeton universities before joining NYU in 2014. Among his many acclaimed books are In My Father's House, Cosmopolitanism, The Honor Code, How Moral Revolutions Happen, and The Ties That Bind. He's been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society, and was inducted in 2008 into the American Academy of Arts and Letters. So just a format note, we have 1 hour to discuss, and then we'll have 30 minutes for questions, and I think there are note cards that will be made available for queries. And I guess I thought I might start with Nisreen. I want to quote the late Edward Said and sort of invoke the notion of the permission to narrate. Mm-hmm. And you've called for more inclusive stories, different stories in your book. How do you see this playing out in the current mediascape? And from your vantage point, both at The Guardian, but also as someone of Sudanese heritage who's lived in Cairo, who lives in Nairobi, which is a different sort of center, as it were.
Thank you. Thank you for that great introduction. I think it's a good way of framing the conversation. I'd like to start just a step before that, before I answer your 2 questions, is why do we need to counter global intellectual inequality? What is the purpose behind that? And also, what does global intellectual inequality look like? And it looks like inequality or deficiency everywhere. It's not just that there is this sufficient place and a deficient place, and the deficient place needs to be kind of tooled up to look like the sufficient place. Yep. It's a universal poverty that is informed by that kind of lack of exchange, right? And what is this notion of stories? Why do we need those different stories or these new stories? There is, I think, this particular moment in kind of contemporary history, this moment we're living in, is a very telling and very kind of vivid illustration of how we are told that things cannot be different, right? No matter how stark or how dramatic the situation is, the answer is that, well, this is just the way it is, right? This is the end of the story. We've kind of played it out, we've written it, and it cannot be any different. And these stories are economic stories. They're stories about how we can provide for people. They're stories about healthcare, how we cannot socialize healthcare. They're stories about foreign policy, that we're limited in our capacity to make foreign policy decisions that make people's lives better. Our enemies are set, our friends are set, and they cannot move between those two categories. Right. Iran, North Korea, and China will forever be these demons, and our allies, even if it's Saudi Arabia or other places that literally chop people up and stuff them in bags, they will always be allies. So the notion of stories is about our inability to kind of break out from this framing of our lives as set and predetermined by people who have done the work and who tell us informatively, sort of with emphasis and with credibility, that we've been in the rooms where we've been in the lab, and these stories cannot be changed. So that's the importance of questioning the story, right? And the idea that this is something that is not possible, or something, there's this common phrasing in sort of centrist or liberal politics, which is, we have to be pragmatic, right? We have to try and focus on what is achievable, which is always a by-phrase for what we are willing to achieve, right? What we're willing to imagine. So that's kind of the first component of the importance of stories, which is when we realize that new stories or new formations are possible, we then realize that what we exist in is a tyranny, it's a fiction by people who have decided this is the only structure that is permissible. The second point is, this relates to why it's important not to really question why these stories are needed. This is very important, and I think an important thing to say at the top of the conversation, at least for me, countering global intellectual inequality, as well as not being a matter of deficiency and sufficiency, it's also not a brute exercise in kind of equalization, right, or representation. It's not about sort of eating our political porridge, as it were. You know what I mean? It's not about just doing something that is healthy for us, because it's bland and it's tasteless, but it's kind of morally the right thing to do. It is good for everyone, okay? Because what it does is it expands our reference points and enlightens us to the fact that our conception of the world is incredibly limited, and our ability to break out and imagine new solutions for contemporary problems can only really be done if we take in as much information as possible from different experiences. And that extends to everything. It extends not to just what I mentioned earlier, which is healthcare, the economy, even our kind of legal system. It extends to our view of history. It extends to our view of empire. It extends to our view of what power looks like, who holds power. History did not just begin in the last 200 years. It extends to who we associate with power and the people who look like they hold power. So it is a widening of the lens that ultimately just gives us the truth of what the lived experience is, not just kind of vertically across our current state, but sort of horizontally across time as well. So I thought I'd start with that, which is not an answer to your question, but I'm sure I'll get there.
It's a good point of departure. So the task is imagining a different world.
Yes.
Than the one that we think we've inherited.
Exactly.
And you mentioned the past, and I wanted to transition to Ranjit. And Ranjit, you've really sensitively written about how in this largely Eurocentric world, Europe itself is a product of the confluence of multiple geographies, influences, traditions. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about perhaps your book, Confluences, and also how history can be marshaled to understand both our syncretic past, but also chart a path forward.
Negar, thank you very much for this. I also want to, before I say anything else, I want to express my gratitude for the conveners of this occasion, because it's the depth and the intensity and the thoughtfulness of these conversations that we've been engaged with in the course of these days that far surpasses anything that you might have at a literary festival or an academic conference. There's a very strong sense that there are existential stakes here. It's not just, an intellectual pursuit. So this is where I would come from in answering your question, because the book that Ilya Tryanov and I wrote together, Confluences, came out of our great sense of discontent and disquiet in the early years of the 21st century with the way in which the ghost of the clash of civilizations was being invoked as almost a theological justification for the wars that were being unleashed in Iraq and Afghanistan. And both Ilya and I were particularly concerned with the rising tide of Islamophobia and the way in which one particular, if influential account of Islam, the Wahhabi version, was taken to represent all of Islam. I'm thinking here of Shahab Ahmed's marvelous way of thinking about Islams in the plural with a lowercase I rather than Islam uppercase. So these were some of the questions, because for me, I have this diasporic background within South Asia, which connects Kashmir and the West Coast. Ilya is a German novelist of Bulgarian origin and grew up in North Africa. So neither of us was comfortable with a view of the world where we had to sit quietly in identities marked with ethnicity, region, language, race, whatever it might be. So we wrote a series of essays questioning the notion of the West as being unique, as being always in the ascendant and always having had some monopoly on reason, and a particular and unique way of thinking about the debate between reason and faith. And this led us really on a journey which involved the circulation of people, of goods, of ideas, values. And as we wrote ourselves into this narrative, we were also surprised at how so much of this, which we took for granted, just came as news to interlocutors, particularly in Europe. We thought back to how many of these discussions, for instance, I'm going to summarize, it's a book that has various theaters, but we were really looking at where the idea of Europe comes from, in a way, and the things that Europe is so proud of. We found ourselves focusing on the 700 years of Al-Andalus, the ecumeny in Spain, where people who were Jewish and Muslim and Christian found ways of coexisting. We were not presenting this in a utopian, nostalgic way at all. Of course, we accept this conflict and violence. But despite the conflict and the violence, there were also very, very dominant forms of collaboration and cooperation. Translation played a key role in this, finding common ground, what much, much later would, in a different context, would be called Irenics. I mean, how do you give up your prerogative to pursue a polemical understanding of dialogue? And how do you move to a form of dialogue that's premised on establishing peace, for instance? And we just found ourselves marshalling so much evidence that came out of this. Just thinking through, for instance, how some of the foundational texts of modern Judaism were actually written in Arabic. I'm going to leave it there. I'm just going to ask us to think about a thinker who knew himself and his contemporaries knew him as Musa ibn Maimun al-Qurtubi. Now, to our ears, this might sound like an Arabic, a Muslim name. Now, this is the thinker who much, much later was given the rather late Latin name of Maimonides. And the text that he wrote, Dalalat al-Hayrin, A Guide to the Perplexed, he wrote that in Arabic. This was a Jewish person who wrote in Arabic. That was his first language. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to leave you with this thought of this confluential figure who found ways of belonging in different religious and linguistic and regional contexts.
Thank you. I think we'll come back to the question of language and translation. Anthony, you've written movingly about many of these questions, especially in the book that I most recently read, which is Cosmopolitanism, that goes some way in elaborating a sort of global ethics. And you find inspiration in the Greek cynics of the 4th century BC, who first articulated the cosmopolitan ideal, so the notion that all human beings were fellow citizens of the world. I wonder if we could speak a bit about your perch at the academy and how you see these questions, how knowledge production and dissemination function, how they can be improved. And furthermore, I'm especially interested in your global ethics course that we talked a little bit about, and maybe its Confucian inflection, and how that may serve as a model for rethinking what we consider the canon. That's a lot, but however.
I'd like to join my co-panelists in thanking the organizers and thanking you for guiding us through this conversation. The Global Academy is a network of institutions, and while it's deeply imperfect, those institutions are, many of them, among the most cosmopolitan human institutions. I teach philosophy in an analytic philosophy department. The parents of my colleagues in that department come from Rwanda, Ghana, England, Australia, Germany. There's probably some people whose ancestors are mostly American, but and that's not because we were looking to be a multinational department. It's because we went out into the world looking for people we wanted to hire, and it turned out that's who we wanted to hire. I got a degree from Cambridge, but my first job was at the University of Ghana. I took an English education, and I was able to function in the premier university in Ghana because, of course, the premier university in Ghana was a colonial institution that had grown out of an external college, the University of London. Somehow the modern university is very, my dean is an Italian. And on the other hand, we're talking about inequality. And we live in a world full of inequalities. And this more than average cosmopolitan set of institutions is itself deeply unequal in lots of ways. First of all, the kind of universities that I've taught at, and I've taught in France and Britain and Ghana and the United States, are all elite institutions. So they reflect the inequalities of the countries that they're in. Lots and lots of people in this, I can't remember the numbers exactly, but I think in Britain, if you're in the bottom 15% of the income distribution, your kids have a 1% chance of going to college, something like that. So we're embedded in local inequalities, even though we're in some ways trying to be institutions that, that at least equalize the discourse space in the sense of being willing to listen to, in principle, to everybody. But we don't, in practice, listen to everybody. And of course, that would be very hard. There's 8 billion people and 10,000 languages. You can't be equipped to have a conversation in 10,000 languages, however smart you are. So the landscape of our cosmopolitanism is shaped by the fact that that most French of French institutions, Sciences Po, now teaches mostly in English. So even France has to accept a kind of linguistic inequality. Even one of the, veto-holding members of the Security Council has to accept that. And many of our Chinese colleagues embarrass us by being able to talk to us in English when at least I can't talk to them in Chinese. So there are lots of those kinds of inequalities, and I think that one of the tasks of all the universities, the University of Ghana has a tradition of helping to more richly cosmopolitanize the global academy by the activities of some very important Ghanaian philosophers who taught there. Predictably, they had degrees from Oxford and Harvard, but they were living and working and teaching in Ghana, and they developed some of the more important discussions in contemporary, what's called African philosophy, but it's really the African voice in world philosophy. And we should all be doing that, I think. That is, in all those places. And as Nasreen said, the inequalities are not diminish every point in the network. It's not that the cosmopolitanism of NYU means, as it were, we've got it right and we are not diminished because we have all these people from everywhere. Lots and lots of things don't get heard in our institutions. So I think one of the things we should be doing, those of us who are, say, in the American Academy, is making it easier for our students to access a wider range of knowledge and perspective and ignorance. I mean, you don't have to, not everything you teach has to be true, it just has to be interesting. And so that's why when I got to NYU, because we have Georgetown, my first teaching in the Gulf, we have a campus in Abu Dhabi. My first teaching in the Gulf was at the Georgetown campus in Doha, which was an extremely interesting experience. But because we have these three sites where we recruit students, Abu Dhabi, Shanghai, and New York, I thought if I'm going to teach a global ethics class at this university, we should at least have strong Arab voices and strong Chinese voices, as well as strong North Atlantic voices in the conversation. So this introduction to, and of course, that's relatively easy to do for two reasons. One, the Arab voices are the voices of people who read Aristotle, so they were already in dialogue with the philosophical traditions that are at the root of the traditions of the North Atlantic. And over the last 30, 40 years in the English-speaking world, there's been a huge amount of incredibly interesting work discussing and translating, particularly Confucian, but other Chinese traditions, so that I don't have to know Chinese to be able to at least teach an introductory course in which there's a lot of Chinese material. And so the students who come to this class learn that ethics is a long history, that it's rooted in many places. If I were wiser and more knowledgeable, I would, of course, include some of the traditions of South Asia. And I mention them to make the point that this form of cosmopolitanism is limited. But I think sort of starting off with the thought that those are the places to start when you're thinking about global ethical questions. And I always say to them for two reasons. One is it's a sign of respect for people to take their ideas seriously, whether you agree with them or not. But from an epistemic point of view, I think more importantly, we will learn things that we wouldn't learn if we didn't talk to those people. For a very long time, a couple of thousand years, Chinese philosophers have had a deep grasp of the importance of relationship to ethical life. I mean, starting with Confucius, strengthened in Mencius. That's something on which the sort of traditions of, as it were, Aristotelian Western ethics is not very good about. I mean, Aristotle has stuff to say about friendship, but mostly that rich tradition of thinking about spousal relations, relations among siblings, relations among neighbors, that's a very ancient tradition to think about that. And it enriches our understanding. A lot of what they say is not just interesting, it's true. And even when it's not true, it challenges us to get our ideas right. And the same is true with some of the interesting ideas in Muslim religious traditions. So that's, I think, it's all very imperfect. You're going to ask us to think about translation in a minute. That's obviously one of the challenges. But I think we're in a better place than we have been. And I'll just say one final thing, which is that I think our new technologies are allowing us to, my publisher told me yesterday that I was about to get copies of the Japanese translation of one of my books, which of course I won't be able to read. But I was able to find its title in Japanese by myself. Because if you put cosmopolitanism into Google Translate, it gives you a word. And if you put that into amazon.co.jp, that word plus my name produces a picture of my book. That's a sort of trivial example of something deeper, which is that we can now hope for automatic translation of. Now, philosophy is one of the hardest things to do machine translation on because the nuances disappear. The only harder thing is poetry, which I think we should not trust machines to translate for us. But I think we're in an age where we can take advantage of that, and also we can converse through the web. We're limited by our languages, but we can converse through the web with people anywhere now, except the ones that are in prison.
Right. Thank you. Maybe we can talk about that a bit more, the sort of promise and peril of technology, the connectivity, but also its siloing effects. But just to build on the question of language and translation, I wonder if both Ranjit and Nesreen, you could speak to that question in the context of your own respective work. I mean, translation is very much about power. If we think about the Arabian Nights, it's always been the domain of white men who've translated that text until very recently. It's about access, it's about proclamation. Things are shifting. There's something, NYU has, I forget what it's called. I think it's called the Library of Arabic Literature,
Yeah.
which has gone a long way in translating, for example, the works of someone like Ahmed Faris Shidyak, who's a 19th century philosopher from Lebanon, sort of protagonist in Arab modernity, et cetera. So a lot has changed, but I'd love to hear it from you guys.
Yeah, I actually just this goes to your first question about the media, and I wanted to slightly contextualize the sort of state of intellectual inequality that we're in today, because I think the sharpness of it is quite recent, relatively, because I think there was a time, particularly in the kind of post-colonial era, so 50s, 60s, and 70s, where there was more of an exchange. There was an exchange not only between Africa, which is where I'm from, so I can speak about it a bit more specifically. An exchange between Africa and racial equality movements in Europe. There was a strong kind of pan-African, pan-racial solidarity, and it wasn't just forged in the furnace of resistance. It was to learn, right? It was like, how did you do this? How can we empower each other? And how can we kind of create an identity politics movement that will raise us all. So there was that relationship that has now lapsed, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why that has happened. Part of it is because the spaces in which these things were forged had become erased by austerity, basically, economic austerity since the 1970s. But there was also, parallel to that, there was a kind of intra-Arab, intra-African exchange, which feels completely unimaginable to be now in a continent that is very siloed, and even the Arab world feels very siloed. I want to speak about just 3 things to show you how the world has changed so dramatically only in the past 40 years across these 2 divisions. So I don't know if anybody here recalls, or even if you are familiar with it, Nagar, there was one of the most formative movie of my childhood was a film called The Message, which was a chronicling of the life of the Prophet Muhammad. And it was a collaboration between Hollywood Arab actors and funded by Muammar Gaddafi, like mostly funded by Libya. And the main character was Anthony Quinn. And it was filmed in English and it was dubbed entirely in Arabic. And it was 3 hours long. And it was this odyssey of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, which is something we grew up with. That is unimaginable today, that there would be that kind of collaboration. And it wasn't just a collaboration, it was an unremarkable collaboration. So if you look at I just have a short, I'm going to give you just short clippings of the reviews. Just consider that I'm reading this to you in contrast of a time now where Palestinian students dancing the Debka in Colombia is described as a cult-like dance, right? Something scary. So this is a movie about the life of the Prophet Muhammad. These were the reviews in the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, the Associated Press, the Evening Standard, in the late 1970s. So, superbly rendered, strong and convincing, spectacularly done. Anthony Quinn acted with dignity and stature, completely right for the role. Decent, big budget religious movie, no more, no less. I mean, I just can imagine having that kind of indifference to a movie about the Prophet Muhammad. And it actually was nominated for an Academy Award for its score. So these people, representatives of Muammar Gaddafi, were in Hollywood to receive an Academy Award. They then lost to Star Wars. So this is just unimaginable today. That kind of not only cultural exchange, curiosity about Islam, curiosity about the history of Islam. The thing that was quite remarkable about the film that I remember was that it was not propagandic in any way. It was purely factual and biographical. So that's one example, sort of between the West and the Arab world, or then North Africa. The second example is two types of what I call Ramadan soaps. So where I grew up and across the Arab world, in Ramadan for 30 days, there was a daily soap opera that was exactly 30 episodes long. And it was mostly historical. One remarkable one that was quite a big hit was called Al-Jawarih, and it was a soap opera about pre-Islamic tribal warfare, tribal warlords. No religion aspect to it at all, no Abrahamic aspect at all, just a kind of chronology and anthology of pre-Abrahamic life in the Arabian Peninsula. That also would not happen today, because in the past 20 years, there has been a chilling of that kind of curiosity about life outside the Muslim sphere. And the second sort of genre was just chronicles of life in the Muslim Empire, in Andalusia, in Sindh. And it was a soap opera. It was affairs and divorces and illegitimate children, but all under this kind of umbrella of Islamic empire. This kind of stuff over the past 20, 30 years receded, not because of a kind of lack of interest in this kind of material, but because of a balkanization and a parochialism that has been wrought by the concentration of power in very few cultural centers, and how that erases, dominates, and actually eliminates the appetites of people. And so I just wanted to speak about that kind of media, the way media, in the way it develops when power accumulates in certain cultural centers, it actually does not just reflect and project the power of that cultural center. It actually creates a fiction of what appetite exists out there and curiosity for this sort of stuff, which relates to my first point about the purpose behind equalization and is not representation, it's enrichment, because people want to learn and understand and experience these things.
Right. Beautiful. It almost makes you, when you referenced Pan-Arabism and Pan-Islamism, it makes you nostalgic for those old political allegiances, the Monoline movement, et cetera, et cetera. Anthony and I spoke the other day on the phone about Transition Magazine, which was a magazine of avant-garde African writing, edited by an Indian intellectual in Uganda. It still exists, but it's based at Harvard now, slightly different. But those kinds of, maybe we can toward the end of the discussion, think about just pragmatically how can we create those kinds of platforms and incubators for a kind of contrapuntal thought and consolidation of different traditions. Thank you. Ranjit, the question of language, or any response actually to what Nasreen
Yeah, I'm actually one of the anxieties I have in this context is, when we translate other philosophies, other positions, why are we doing that? Is that in order to accumulate in some way a larger sense of how people have seen the world? Or are we transformed in the act of doing that? And I say this because for reasons that are obvious to all of us, I think many of us are trained in, are shaped by a tradition of philosophy, an account of being in the world and of participating in the world that comes from a certain dominant strand within the Enlightenment. And that is an account which commits us to the sovereign individual, in relation to which all of nature, for instance, would be a set of resources that can be used. And I want to invoke a philosopher whose work some of you will obviously know, but I found very, very generative Akhil Bilgrami, who's at Columbia, and I was going to say he says eloquently, but I have a paraphrase of it. But I'm going to talk about building off his critique. He asks these questions. How and when did we transform the concept of nature into natural resources? How and when did we transform the concept of human beings into citizens? How and when did we transform communities into populations? And how and when did we transform a knowledge to live by into technocratic expertise? And I think, to me, this is the pivot of these questions. Because does it mean that we remain committed to this view of the world, which eventually commits us to a relatively narrow understanding of reason, which commits us to a certain materialism that's skeptical of possibilities of transcendence, which commits us also to ultimately a certain kind of empiricism that refuses to take on trust anything for which we don't have instruments with which to gauge these things. In that kind of context, if this is where we, as it were, where we ground ourselves, how then do we bring in the teachings of other traditions that do not begin from these premises? We may well translate them, we may savor them in a certain way, but are we willing to be transformed by, say, the Buddhism of Shantideva, the 10th century Yogacara Buddhist deep psychology? Because that would urge us to consider a completely different account of self and the relationship of self to nature, the questions of how we participate with others, how rather than our sovereign rights as individuals, which we guard zealously, we're willing to see how those rights accord with the needs of a larger community. So these are the questions that I find perplexing. So whilst I'm very happy to receive the gifts of translation, I'm wondering if those translations eventually fall short of something that they need to do, apart from bringing us, intellectual goodies. What is our wager in this? What is at risk for us? Are we willing to be transformed?
Right.
That's something I wanted to share here.
Beautifully said. That willingness to be transformed, how do you see that? And you can decline answering this question, but playing out in the Indian political context right now, where there is a narrowing.
Absolutely.
Are there?
Yeah, I think that is tragic to me, because it cuts against everything that has actually traditionally defined the life of the mind in India, the religious imagination. As far back as you look in a South Asian context, it is through dialogue among dissimilar schools or movements or attitudes that, that the religious imagination has really been nourished. I mean, there's a reason. We now have a very, very flat, populist understanding of what it means to be Hindu. It is really a politicized religiosity. It does not take into account forms of illumination, of enlightenment. It takes a particular kind of cultural identity and gives it a seemingly religious aura. But as far back as you look, even to the axial age, you find that there is, for instance, a generative tension between what are called the Brahminical schools and the Shramanic schools. You know, the religion of the priest and the householder on the one hand, the religion of the quester who goes out into the wilderness, into nature, and brings back forms of illumination. So, and then of course the millennium, the absolutely vibrant millennium of dialogue between forms of Islam and forms of Hinduism and forms of late Buddhism. I mean, that to my mind is what represents the religious imagination in South Asia. Again, based on the risk of embracing difference, based on speaking the language of the other, imagining what it might mean to be the other, and then to develop a culture and religious practices that form a synergy, that embody this confluence. So to me, this is not even a turning back. It's often described as a fundamentalist or a revivalist movement. This is not reviving anything. It's a kind of zombie modern that we're looking at, yeah?
Right. I guess we opened with some policy questions in the beginning, which is sort of the agenda that we inherited. And I just wonder, Anthony, you spoke of other ethical traditions, et cetera. Nasreen, you spoke a little bit about the limitations of Western feminism and the paradoxes of sort of a performative, triumphalist advance, but then at the same time we're still struggling for reproductive rights, et cetera. And I guess a question for all of you is to think about is what can we learn from other traditions, intellectual traditions, in puzzling over the problems of today? And I wonder how you see that in each of your respective fields playing out, or if any immediate case study comes to mind. It's a big question.
I think so I completely agree that the point of translation is to open you up to the possibility of being different from what you were before the translation arrived. And as I say, this is what I say to my students. I'm not telling you these things because they're curiosities. I think we can learn from engagement with these traditions. And if you're not interested in learning from them, it's just, I don't know, what's the point of it? But the point about these cosmopolitan conversations is you don't know what you don't know until you start. So you don't know if or whether or how you will be transformed, but there's no point in it if you aren't open to transformation. And one of the ways in which one can think about this is in actually John Stuart Mill's language of, he talked about experiments of living. One of his arguments for liberty was that he said, we would all profit from allowing people to try out different ways of being and thinking in the world. And it might be good for the people who were doing the experiment, but it would be good for all of us because we could learn from each other's experiments. And so I think absolutely we need to be open to, we're not going to, I think somebody said this on the previous panel and it seems true, this is not about coming to agreement, but it is about a wager that we can learn from one another. And so you're listening. Of course, you think you have things to teach. So you're in the conversation because you think you have things you can add. And I think that way of thinking about it is, it's very much the attitude that prevailed in 9th century Baghdad, in Al-Andalus, and so on. And to a certain extent in Athens, I think, in the time of, Diogenes, say. or Aristotle. And that produced some really interesting stuff, some really interesting learning. And Diogenes, who may have been the first person to say he was a cosmopolitist, he was from Turkey. He was from Sinop on the Black Sea. But he was welcomed in Athens, even though he was a very, very peculiar and difficult person. So, I think, to the extent that good things came out of Athens in that period, it wasn't because they were digging into themselves. It was because they were opening up to others, and they were waiting to see what you could learn from that, and they learned a lot.
So your question was about models.
Yeah, or that sounds really reductionist.
Yes, but examples where this has been successful or has not been successful. Well, I mean, not to be a downer, but I'm going to talk about ways in which it is not successful, but only because I think in this particular way I'm going to talk about it, it can be made successful very easily. So there is a model of writing about the world, or writing about the kind of non-Western world in journalism or deep reporting or long-form foreign reporting that has a kind of set regime. So you have the foreign correspondent, and who is usually from the metropolis, right? He's from London or Paris or New York, and he is sent out into the world with very good intentions, to write about all of these various experiences, not just negative, but positive as well. Like, people get that now. But he's always accompanied by a character called a stringer. And the stringer is sort of this, like, almost medieval native informant, right? Who translates the world and the experience to the foreign correspondent in a way that always means that whatever the result is, it's always just like a chromosome off reality, if that makes sense. Just a kind of shade of what a local would recognize, but then it fits in very neatly with the form and language and sort of presentation of the metropolis. Western media organizations grapple a lot and have grappled a lot, particularly since Black Lives Matter, with like this stringer person, this like fixer, stringer/fixer, which is even worse. So the stringer kind of does the local reporting, and the fixer sets you up with the meetings and the cars and the security, and it's just this very elaborate ecosystem of obfuscation, I think. But anyway, sometimes it works. So what they have decided is they need to replace the foreign correspondent with a local foreign correspondent, right? People are very smug about this. We've cracked it. No more stringers, no more fixers, local foreign correspondents. We're going to have Kenyan people in Kenya, Sudanese people in Sudan, so on and so forth. And I'm one of those people, right? I'm one of those people that solved a problem for Western media organizations, because I like talk and understand the sort of Western context, and can translate very complex local contexts and heritages and legacies. But the problem is I am from a certain class, right? I am from a certain class, and I'm from a certain educational background, that no matter how hard I try, no matter how long I have lived in my local context, and I was born and bred in Sudan and didn't leave the Middle East or North Africa until I was in my mid-20s, still my experience has more proximity in terms of the like intellectual language of knowledge to the West than it does to where I'm from. And so when you try and explain to people that even this like revolutionary thing that you have done, this like defenestration of the mythical foreign correspondent, and giving this position to a local is still not enough. It's very difficult to compute and to process, because it's like, we have represented, we have brought this person in. So I think the reason I'm raising this and talking about it is I think this is an easy way to communicate that when you want to really learn the truth about a place, you also have to understand all the different ways in which your class and your knowledge structure is reproduced in this place as well. And so you need to look deeper. You need to work harder, and you need to find people that perhaps do not have the same facility that you do or that you would like, and perhaps it would take a lot more work to train them up. Their copy might be, a little bit rougher. Their references might be not particularly compatible, but you need to work with them to get these sort of much more intimate experiences. And we have been actually successful in The Guardian a couple of times with foreign local correspondents that do not hail from these kinds of classes at all, and their reporting, and their particularly long form reporting, is really quite, not just outstanding, but quite different. It feels like it unlocks this new space and new language and kind of brings new perspectives. Because I'll just say this one last thing, because the problem when you extend your own kind of class and material orientation to a local, what they will take with them is the same perspective that you have, right? So what you will find surprising, they will find surprising. What you find banal, they will find banal, if that makes sense. So yeah, on the point of like models that can work, it's to look beyond race, beyond nationality, beyond skin color, and go that level further into like deep locality, because that's the only way you can entirely separate yourself from the kind of figures that would reproduce your worldview.
I'm so happy you've managed to do that, because in a media context in which there are shrinking budgets for foreign.
Yes. Yeah, no one has time to like, train someone up for 2 years. And then, you know what it's like, people like, their copy is clean, their copy is clean. Right. That's all everyone cares about. But this process requires not only investment of resources, but time and humility. Right. And I think it's possible if one just adopts that orientation.
Yeah, this is why I've always pushed for writing workshops in the so-called peripheries, but just to play into the cliche. But also translation, because there could be an exceptional reporter who's, fluent in Arabic, but it takes resources.
Well, there is one example of a Scandinavian newspaper, which I will not name, who has hired a couple of years ago an Arab reporter to become their kind of Middle East correspondent. And he does not speak that native Scandinavian language, but he files in Arabic, and there is an in-house translator that translates his copy into the language, and it is printed, and nobody who reads the paper knows that it was filed entirely in a different language.
That's a great.
That's also a model of how it can be done.
I'm thinking of one character that I'm sure you know well, Ghaith Abdelahad.
Yes. Yeah.
Who is an Iraqi. I think he was a student of architecture, but he worked as a stringer for a number of prominent Western newspapers at the time of the invasion of Iraq. And it turns out he's an incredible writer in English and has since, but that's a success story.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Mm-hmm. Ranjit, do you have any thoughts? Again, we're sort of a little bit all over the place. But... wait, questions. Okay, I'm sorry. My clock is...
Oh gosh, it's time for Q&A already.
Yeah, it's time for Q&A. Thank you all. The first question is, how can we better integrate perspectives from the Global South into global discussions, considering their historical exclusion from international bodies? So this is a question we've kind of touched on, but maybe, again, some of this conversation was a bit lofty. How do we ground it in... Nisreen, you spoke a little bit about what can happen at the level of journalism. Anthony and Ranjit, do you have any thoughts about pragmatically how we can integrate the experiences and perspectives of the Global South?
I mean, so there's sort of, there's a question of who has to have the will to do that. There are lots and lots of people who'd be perfectly willing to come if you ask them, and the UN has forums like the Forum of First Peoples, and turns out Aboriginal activists and Maori activists and Quechua activists will show up if you invite them, But I don't get the sense that a lot of what they've done has had a huge impact on anything. Maybe a little bit of an impact on how states think about First Peoples, a little bit. But honestly, insofar as there's been good movement on those things, it really doesn't come through that system. It's come through things like the conversations in New Zealand between Maoris and later European arrivals, or the interesting conversations about multiculturalism and in Canada and First Peoples of Canada and so on. That wasn't really driven by the international system, it was driven by Canadian ideas, and obviously deeply affected by the fact that Canada thinks of itself as a sort of colonial state, as being a two-nation, Anglo and Franco. So it's sort of easier for them to add in other voices because they've already committed to that picture themselves. We don't, in this country, really think of ourselves in quite that way. So, but I would say, this is not an answer to the practical question, but the real question is, how do you get anybody who's going to actually do anything to want to do this? I mean, it's hard enough getting 192, states to talk to each other and it's hard enough getting some equalization among who's heard among the states. And then there are all these, states themselves have difficult relations with lots of the identities within them, as happening in India now, it happens in China a lot, it happens in Ghana, where I grew up. So I'd say, just as in the sort of academic context, the question is how to generate the curiosity that will then be able to absorb in a respectful way a greater variety of voices and traditions. How, in the political context, to create a sort of political curiosity so that these international organizations and the fora through which states talk to one another, it's not just a matter of bringing people in, it's a matter of people being open to being changed by their arrival. And I don't have a practical thought about that.
Two sort of very artisanal ways of, hands-on ways of responding to this. I think too often we tend to think that singular events will bring about transformation. I think that we really need to commit ourselves to a processed way of thinking. It's a gradual transformation to see the point of view of the other. The other little point I want to make is that if you always have the sense that you're going to bring people to the center, to the heart of the empire, it sort of defeats the purpose.
Yeah.
I have a great belief in nomadic institutions. I think the center needs to migrate and wander hither and yon and be willing to be in culturally uncomfortable situations. Because unless you have that visceral experience of what it means to be someone else, to be somewhere else, you're just receiving news from the borders of the empire. Otherwise, that's not helpful. I think you need to be committed to something else. Sorry, I keep harping on this idea of self-transformation, but I think without that, there's no point. You're just building up dossiers on what it might be like somewhere else.
Yeah. I like the idea of nomadic institutions. All of the questions, which makes sense, they sort of focus in and around the university. So how can student and faculty collaborations foster intellectual exchanges that bridge global north-south divides? And Anthony, you and I spoke a little bit about...
Yes. In our conversation, I was reminded of a colleague of mine, friend. We actually both grew up in Kumasi in Ghana. He's a bit younger than I am, but he was the same age as one of my sisters, so he's a family friend. He's now chairman of African Studies at Harvard. And he has graduate students in Ghana, which most Harvard professors don't, have graduate students elsewhere. And he spends part of his year, we academics have the privilege of being off for several months a year, so he spends those months there and is, collaborating with them. And, the ones who are working on materials that involve can languages, well, he's a first language speaker of those languages, or one of those languages, and that means you can understand most of them. So, I don't know. I mean, I think those sorts of collaborations are very, very helpful. We like to send our students to a dozen global sites at NYU where there's one in Accra, where they can go and study with Ghanaian scholars and with each other and with students from all around the world for a period, for a semester or 3 weeks in January, whatever. I think that sense of learning by being in the other place, the place you're not used to, is a very important thing. And I think the students who do that value it a lot.
I actually met Ranjit like 15 years ago at JNU in Delhi, and I had my mind blown by the students, actually. So yeah, one could benefit from leaving the comfort of one's own campus. The next question is, what role do digital libraries and open access resources play in reducing intellectual inequality? And again, this comes back a little bit to the question of access, translation, et cetera. Thanks, Anthony. Again, sort of.
I mean, there has been progress here in one way. Most of us now on American campuses get access to academic journals through something like JSTOR or Muse, if you're a humanist. When JSTOR started out, they committed themselves. If you're at Georgetown using JSTOR, Georgetown is paying a lot of money to have a license to use this stuff. But they committed themselves, I believe, at the start to making those resources available in, say, African countries, essentially for nothing. I mean, so you don't have, they had to give them passwords because it's password protected, but they didn't make them pay for them, basically. Whereas starting in the mid-70s in Ghana, what had been a great university library in the early post-colonial period, I mean, there was a period of great inflation, government had not much money, there were a lot of visits to the IMF. One dimension of structural adjustment was reducing investment in tertiary education. And so actually the year that I spent 75-6 at the University of Ghana, I think the foreign exchange budget of the university for books was $100. So basically that library was,
Right.
It's a great library until about 1975. If you want to study British philosophy in the 50s and 60s, you can do it just as well in the Baum Library of the University of Ghana as you can in Cambridge or Oxford, but everything since. But that doesn't matter anymore now because most of the journals are available basically for nothing to the university through these assemblies. But what's in JSTOR? And the answer is a lot, but not everything, and a lot of the knowledge that's being produced in what we don't like to call the periphery, but in the places that aren't close to the centers of power, isn't as powerfully present as it should be. And so your sense of what journal-based academic knowledge is shaped by what the journals you can get through the way you get your journals, which is JSTOR or one of those things. And so I'm sure they're very conscious of this and they try to do their best to represent. But the other thing, of course, that means is that it's very, very Anglo-centric. And knowledge is being produced in all the languages of the world. My mother and I translated 7,500 proverbs in my father's language and published them. That means that a certain part of the oral tradition of a place is available now to English speakers, but it isn't available to Chinese speakers, I mean, unless they learn English. So I think the technology has made it easier to gain, the marginal cost of adding an extra user is so low that we can pay for it here and have it available anywhere. But what we have collected is going to be shaped by who has money and status right now. And so a lot of the voices will be less well represented than they would be if you were trying to open yourself to transformation from anywhere.
Right. A great question. Could you comment on the phenomenon of brain drain? When talented thinkers migrate from the global south to elite institutions in the north, does that make global intellectual inequality worse? Any thoughts on
yes.
brain drain? Yeah.
In a word, yes. This is a huge problem, and also comes back to sort of my earlier point about connections between these classes and how they can all talk to each other. And one thing that I have heard amongst the student class who are exchange students or who are foreign students is that there is sometimes a sense, and this I want to through this answer your previous question or talk about your previous question a little bit, that they come to places like Georgetown with a view to returning, right, or with a view to going back and making use of what they have learned, because their parents, in many instances, their parents also kind of fell through the quicksand and never came back, never left the US, and they very clearly have an agenda to go back. It's kind of quite young generation that understand that the like hypnotic, like facilities of the West sometimes can deracinate them in a way that feels quite scary. But one thing that they told me in kind of separate conversations, and which I have heard before in other contexts, is that the benefit of them being here is quite limited to both parties, or could be wider to both parties, because they're expected to settle in. They're expected just to fit in the way, I suppose, their parents did when they moved here in the 70s and 80s. And the way they see their role is to actually unsettle the place to which they have come. And I think this relates to your previous question, which is like, what are these models of exchange and models of equalization? And I think the heart of it is to not expect that it can be done without some form of concession, some form of discomfort, and some form of unsettlement. And the concept of brain drain is predicated or premised on the smoothness of the process, that you're going to come and you're going to integrate and you're going to settle in, and nobody is going to expand one way or the other. But I think there is a way in which it can happen, in which it's not a total net loss on both sides, right? In which people can come to centers of knowledge, but those centers of knowledge expand their kind of discomfort levels and allow them to question and unsettle and even suggest things on the curriculum, suggest things that can be done differently, because then you're capitalizing on a new generation's understanding and fear about losing connections that they've seen their relatives lose, but you're also kind of maximizing what you get from your foreign students, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Can I just say, I know it's your turn as it were, but this is sort of an example of something which has been done very consciously in order to try to help with this problem. So there's, as many countries in Africa have, Ghana legalized private universities at a certain point. And the first places that did, the first institutions that did that were the churches. So there's a Catholic university and a Methodist university and so on. But a brilliant young Ghanaian who grew up in Ghana, got a scholarship to Swarthmore, I think, then went to the business school at Berkeley, was a Microsoft product engineer for a while, product manager, ended up with enough money that he thought at a certain point, as a relatively young man, I can either go on being a Microsoft person, or I can take my money and the money of my friends, most of whom are not Ghanaians, but some of them are Indians and some of them are Americans, and we can start a university that means that you don't have to leave Ghana to get what I got at Swarthmore. And so he has created beginning with his own expertise, which was in engineering and in, what were the two subjects? Anyway, computer science. An institution that's now a liberal arts thing that does everything. But from the very beginning, the computer scientists and the engineers were told, this is a liberal education. So you're going to be studying history and philosophy, and as well as mathematics and so on. And it's called Ashesi University. And it's his thought was, if we educate them here and we connect them here with businesses in Ghana and other parts of Africa, then they'll stay. I mean, they went the process of deracination begins with spending 4 years in another country, but you can get a great liberal arts education in Ghana if we build the institutions to do it. And it's been successful, and many of the students come from other parts of Africa, obviously, as well. And those too are more likely to stay in the continent if they don't spend 4 years in Paris or London or Oxford or New York. So I think that's an interesting and successful model. And it's a model that's connected with some of the ideas that are to do with having global campuses. I mean, many of the kids, NYU kids who study in Abu Dhabi, they may not be from Abu Dhabi, but many of them stay in Abu Dhabi. So they don't just they don't become Americans, they become part of the large class of resident foreigners in Abu Dhabi. I mean, so that's perhaps a less satisfactory outcome, but it does mean that they don't think that they have to be in America because they went to NYU, because the part of NYU they went to isn't in America. So I think doing that locally, and Ashesi is deeply interconnected with North American academic institutions, so it's not outside the network by any means, but it is inside the network in a different way, and I think it's been very successful.
And I think there is an awareness, and obviously it's limited to a certain certain category of people that do have the ability to move back and forth. There is an awareness of the tides of deracination, and there is an awareness of the kind of false promise, increasingly clear, thank God, of the kind of material incitements of the West, and particularly in Europe, particularly in the UK, with austerity, with kind of 20 years of defunding the public sphere, and after the financial crash, that sort of promised land seems far less promising, and people are happier to move back and maybe live slightly less prosperous lives, but much more comfortable lives, if that makes sense. So I've seen that not only myself, but in my immediate circle of friends and family from Sudan.
Also, you feel you're making more of a contribution.
Yeah, if you're so minded.
If you're so minded. I mean, I have 3 Nigerian nephews and who went to Oxford and Cambridge. 2 to Cambridge, 1 to Oxford. And one each of the Oxford and Cambridge ones are working in Nigeria. They went back. And if you're an ambitious young person, Nigeria is a very challenging place to work because, for reasons we are all familiar with, but it's an exciting place to work, and you can feel you're making a difference in a way that taking their trainings, and I mean, one of my nephews spent a while working in the Gulf, and he didn't feel he was paid more money, but he wasn't feeling he was making a contribution to a sort of national effort that he cared about.
That's gratifying to hear.
I was just wondering about, this might be irrelevant and pessimistic, but I just want to connect some of these concerns with the concerns of the discussion that preceded ours. What can brain drain look like when conditions in a country become so oppressive that you're forced into exile in a certain way? I have to say, for the last month, I've been rereading what, to my mind, is one of the great books on the subject of an exilic consciousness. It's Stefan Zweig, The Memoirs of a European. It's an extraordinary, deeply sad book. It's someone who is about to kill himself, as he did. He killed himself after he after he'd written the book, evokes everything that he had lost, a culture, a space of being and belonging, and how the forces of fascism destroyed that at every level, from the personal to the collective. I invoke this because sometimes the brain drain could simply be a flowing out of an exodus of intellectuals, which that's a choice that you can't avoid because you find yourself unable to live and work and function at home. So what consequences does that then have? I think it weakens, old-fashioned word, intelligentsia, but I love it. It weakens the class of articulate people who might create resistance, who might put up some form of resistance. It also then commits those in exile to a certain kind of being away, speaking from a distance. So that's a condition, a tragic, I think, but sometimes necessary condition, which I don't want us to lose sight of that as we're.
Yeah, I always find it interesting to think about where people end up. So
I have to say, as I contemplate exile at this very moment, but this is why these questions are so.
No, I think a lot of Indian friends of mine having.
Yeah, it's not only an economic. It's not an economic question. I think when we talk about brain drain or sort of intellectual lopsidedness, you assume automatically that it's an economic question, but actually it goes back to the earlier point about concentration of power and diminishment of models of government and the kind of entrenchment of authoritarianism or very limited modes of democracy. One of the biggest reasons for intellectual brain drain in North Africa is dictatorship and actually lack of safety. And there are North Africa, and particularly Egypt and Libya, are countries where the intelligentsia, to use that lovely old-fashioned word, held on very long. They held on very tight. They took a lot before they were forced to either flee or cease their activities. So the kind of concept of brain drain and the inequality it creates cannot be separated from how we've sort of collectively taken our foot off the pedal in trying to push for more democratic, more equitable, more liberal government. And it's something that isn't necessarily limited to countries that you would associate automatically with being dictatorships. I mean, there's kind of discomfort in the academy in America these past few weeks. Don't know where they would brain drain to, but it's definitely not comfortable.
Canada. Yeah. I mean, there's the economic thing can sound like you just want a better salary, but as I said, when I was at the University of Ghana, you might just want to be able to do your job properly.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that when I was there, the government was locking up. I mean, they were locking up. It was a military government. But it wasn't that academic work was difficult because the government was locking up academics. It was that there were no Xerox machines and no computers and no access to all the things that you had gotten used to as instruments of scholarship. And as I say, the library, which is a great instrument of scholarship, was being given no money. And also, at the same time, because of the economic decline, an institution designed for a few thousand students had 20 and then 30, whatever, I don't know the numbers, but I mean, many, the dormitories, which had rooms designed for 2 people, had 6 people in them. So and they didn't increase the size of the faculty. So the conditions of work without direct oppression, the conditions of work can be very difficult. And if you're a great Ghanaian scholar and somebody says to you, you can come and work here and you'll have the Xerox machine in the library and you can work on the things
research
you want to
assistants.
work on. You have research assistants and you'll be able to spend your summers doing research in Ghana. As an intellectual, you might think, as a scholar, you might think, well, that's how I pursue my scholarly vocation. So making it attractive for the best scholars to stick around is not a big focus, I think, of many. Paul Ntonji, who was perhaps the greatest Francophone African philosopher ever, died recently. He went to the École Normale. He was for a period Minister of Higher Education in Benin, where he came from. which is Dahomey when he was young, and really did a lot to build up the sort of circumstances of work of scholars. I don't know what's happening in Benin now, and he hasn't been minister for a while, but a few people can make a very big difference to those sorts of things. I think that Ashesi University is modeling a way to allow scholars to do their work that's potentially raising the level of everybody, because
Right.
by modeling things. So a few interventions here and there can make a big difference, but then if the government wants to, it can close it all down in a minute. And that's, think about how the Vice Chancellor of Ashoka University was treated. That's the message that sends is that independent thinking, which is the thing that scholars want to do, is not possible here. And those, he's back in India now because he wants to vote, but he spent the last semester in Princeton.
That's right.
So I think it's very hard, even with governments led by scholars. So Dr. Kwame Nkrumah was followed by Dr. Buzia, who spent his exile in Oxford, but was very intolerant of dissent. Right. And if people aren't scholars, it's very hard to get them to grasp how bad for their country it is that they're creating, in the first place, just difficult conditions of work for scholars, but then in the second place, actually shutting them up. And if that happens, the best ones will leave.
You mentioned Dahomey.
We're happy to have them.
Oh, sorry. I was just thinking of this flow, this backwards flow, as paralleling restitution sort of narratives.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Quite powerfully.
I mean, I remember going to a conference in Paris once, which Paulin was at, and it was very moving to hear him, because he had made a choice. He looked around the room and he said to some of his colleagues, I could have stayed here. I beat you all in the exams. That's a very French thing to say. But I wanted to be working at home.
Another question, unless, Ranjit, did you want to? No. How can we challenge or overcome Western intellectual panic over relativism when universalist certainties are challenged?
That's not a last question. That can't be asked.
That's a whole new panel.
Can't be asked at the
Yes,
end.
it's a panel at the next conference.
Can I speak to that and then?
Or do you want to take that? Because we just both spoke, so just have a stab and then we can get to it.
Gosh. Very, very briefly, I tend to be skeptical of, I'm going to come to this question at a kind of oblique angle. I tend to be anxious about where relativism takes us.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, of course, it's true that if you think that there's one metric for what could be universalist, and if that comes from this dominant Enlightenment discourse that I talked about, it obviously is going to exclude a whole range of traditions and perspectives. But the other extreme, that of relativism, where each perspective is isolated within its own preoccupations and criteria, to my mind, that's even more of a tragedy, because if there's a dominant universalism, there's something that you kick up against. But if you agree that everybody has their own universe where they have their own validity, there's nothing to discuss, and there's no common ground to be had. And I can't imagine anything worse than that.
And so, I mean, there's a world, and we're all trying to make a stab at understanding it. It's very hard. I think one thing that the world, the sort of scientific post-Enlightenment world, has somewhat distorted is our sense of the difficulty of knowledge, because we keep, a vaccine is produced within 6 months of the discovery of which could never have happened in the past, of a virus. We say, okay, so knowledge is difficult, and the point of openness is that it makes it more likely that what you'll get will be knowledge. You're not opening yourself up to other points of view because it's entertaining. You're opening up to other points of view because they might be right. And even if they're wrong, and again, this is a point that Mill made, even if they're wrong, understanding why they're wrong will deepen your understanding of what's right. So I don't think you don't need to make relativist arguments for any of this. There are two very powerful non-relativist arguments. One is this one. We need to open ourselves up to the possibilities of truth. And the other is also not a relativist one, which is that we owe other people in their dignity attention to their points of view. They may be wrong, but we still owe it to them to treat them as potential sources of knowledge. And if they're wrong, we should be able to explain why. We shouldn't just not listen to them because it hasn't occurred to us that they might know something.
I think it's not separate from, just to tie it back to my first answer, it's not separate from this question or this pattern of political retrenchment and accumulation of cultural and narrative power in like very few places. Because then the tendency towards universalism becomes sort of quite urgent and almost insecure, that everything has to look like us because we're embattled and few and powerful. And so the idea that the tendency or the result of that is to kind of aggressively other people, because this is the only place, these few chosen places with their limited frames of reference and modes of living, because this is where power resides. These are the only places that are valid and everything else is other. And the political narrative that comes with that, the collapsing of governments and people is where relativism becomes very difficult, because you equate sort of Iran with its people, Russia with its people, North Korea with its people, Hamas with its people. And so then people kick back because they realize instinctively that there are human beings on the other side of this. And they forge sometimes like overly zealous connections to these symbols of resistance to the sort of universal center. But the more that is not, it's a muscle. The more we don't exercise these muscles of exposure and familiarity, the harder it is for us to just coexist and try and learn rather than judge or reject or incorporate even entirely. So I feel like this sort of, what you just referred to as our inability to interact with the other in a way that doesn't either fall into completely justifying and accepting and not examining, or receding back into universal values, is because it's rooted in kind of a political insecurity, and a very strong political story, to get back to kind of how we got into this. And the second thing is because it's just not done enough in ways that are just as Georgetown, one of Georgetown's slogans is kind of, there's no culture of encounter. And therefore you don't exercise that muscle. So you're either scared or you're overzealously embracing because you're looking for some sort of alternative. So I think kind of politics and frequency of contact is the key here.
And maybe to conjure Ranjit's, the willingness to be transformed.
Yes.
Maybe that's a good place to end. Thank you all.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
Josh.